Boldwood presents A Wedding in Provence, written by Alison Roberts and read by Emma Powell. Chapter 1. Perfect. The word was a whispered sigh, the calm before the storm, a blink of time to appreciate that this was the dream. A moment for Sophie Spencer to savour the satisfaction that she was the one who could wave her magic wand and make the dream come true for yet another ecstatic bride. Okay, maybe it wasn't quite the same as experiencing the joy for herself, but it was as close as she was ever going to get. And what was even better, she got to do it again, and it never got old. It never failed to bring tears to her eyes when the groom turned to watch his bride walking towards him. She could always feel the love in the air like a dawn mist and almost catch the promise of their future together. There was always that heartbeat of knowing that it could have been her. She had been that loved. She'd been that close to walking towards the man she loved. Once upon a time. Right now, Sophie was looking at a venue that was the epitome of a fairy tale wedding. A picture postcard medieval castle, the Château d'Orval, nestled amongst vineyards, lavender fields and olive groves in the south of France. Isolated enough to provide privacy for an intimate event, and traditional enough to supply all the historic charm this part of the world was so famous for. Sophie kept driving, the walls of golden stone getting closer as the wheels of her immaculately restored and beloved 1970s 2CV van crunched over the white gravel of the castle's entranceway that was lined by an honour guard of Italian cypress trees. This was definitely her favourite castle. She loved the way the symmetry of the architecture was broken by seemingly random square towers, and that the roofline was punctured by ornate metal finials on the spires of round turrets. She also loved that she could rely on this stunning backdrop to be the one thing that couldn't go wrong in a day that simply had to be perfect. Sophie took a deliberate inward breath, gathering the strength and focus needed to face the hectic pace of the long hours ahead of her. As the managing director of Marry Me in Provence, the ultimate responsibility for this day lay with her, and this particular wedding could very well make or break the company's hard-won reputation as the best in the business for every aspect of destination wedding planning in this idyllic patch of the planet. The 8 million or so followers of Zara Beaumont, an American beauty and lifestyle influencer, would be hanging out for every update on their favourite social media platforms. The car parking area for staff was already a hive of activity. Caterers were unloading coolers, baskets of fresh produce and crates of champagne and heading in the direction of the chateau kitchens. Closer to Sophie, buckets of white flowers and lavender were being carried from the florist's van towards an arched gap in the neatly trimmed cypress hedging that Sophie knew led to the shady courtyard in front of an ancient chapel. A wiry, middle-aged woman who was directing the flower carriers turned her head as Sophie stepped out of her pale lilac van. "Bonjour, Sophie." She held her palm up as if she were presenting the sky. "Il fait beau, oui?" "Bonjour, Flo." Sophie smiled as she glanced up, pushing back a wayward curl of her hair that had already managed to escape her messy bun. Mother Nature was clearly on board today without a single cloud marring the deepening blue of a Mediterranean summer sky. She turned back to the florist as she caught a waft of fragrance. Delphinium, perhaps? Or gardenias? "Tu vas bien?" she asked. Florence puffed out her lips in that very French way of implying that a catastrophe could very well be imminent, but she was so far coping. "Oh, tu sais." Sophie nodded again. She did know. Even here in the open air, she was aware of the hum of tension that came from the culmination of endless months of planning that had to seamlessly blend so many different elements. She could actually feel that hum inside her body, running through her veins, in fact. And she loved it. This was where all the hard work paid off, and the more rumples in the fabric of the day that needed ironing out, the higher the level of satisfaction would be in, Sophie checked her watch. About 16 hours' time, when the wedding of the season wound down around midnight. The vehicles parked in the spaces reserved for the makeup artists, hairdressers and wardrobe team were empty. Sophie could imagine that Zara, along with her bridesmaids, was already being artfully dressed and made up to look as if she'd just tumbled out of bed, ready to mingle around the grazing board of a light, very Provençal breakfast and sip her first flute of champagne as soon as the visual content team arrived to record every moment. With that reminder, Sophie opened a back door of her van to take the bottle of vintage Dom Perignon from its ice bed in a cooler. She also took a moment to adjust the sprig of fresh lavender held in place on the bottle's neck by the perfect bow of ruffled white ribbon. Her first task this morning was to visit the bridal suite, check that Zara had absolutely everything she needed, and make her even happier with the gift of a gorgeous champagne to go with the warm, flaky croissants, figs drizzled with lavender-infused honey, and scrambled eggs with shaved truffle that were amongst the local treats being offered for breakfast. "Miss Spencer?" "That's me." Sophie straightened and turned to find a stranger standing beside her van. She noticed the black painted nails first, on a hand holding an expensive-looking digital camera. When she lifted her gaze, it was momentarily caught by a silver eyelet framing a rather large hole in an earlobe. There was another piercing in an eyebrow. She found a polite smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm Raven," he said, his accent, and possibly that sense of cultivated boredom, suggesting an English public school education. "Ravenvale?" "Oh," Sophie nodded. The name, which was distinctive for probably not having been bestowed at birth, had been memorable. "You're covering the wedding for Vogue, yes?" "That's certainly one of the publications expressing interest." A faint smile tilted his lips. "I'm an independent feature editor specializing in A-list events, and I was lucky enough to have contacts that got me this gig." The smile faded. "I'm supposed to be shadowing your lead photographer, Gregory Glasson." "He'll be parked in the visual content section." Sophie shaded her eyes from the sun. "That's our videographer, Andre, beside the silver SUV, unloading his camera gear. He'll introduce you." "I've met him. That's where the usher told us to park as well. Andre said he hasn't heard from Greg and suggested that we came to find you." A tiny chill ran down Sophie's spine. This was completely out of character for the man who'd not only been her lead photographer right from the start of Marry Me in Provence, but a mentor, with his extensive experience and that dependable father-figure vibe. If anything, she would have expected Greg to have been here since before dawn, capturing the silhouette of the turrets and spires against the first notes of gold and pink heralding the sunrise. On the other hand, he must have dozens of those shots in his library, given how many times they'd used this venue over the years. Why reinvent the wheel? "He won't be far away," she assured Raven. She already had her phone in her hand, and it took only 2 swipes to make that call to Greg that, disturbingly, went straight to voicemail, which meant that he was either on the phone himself or his device was dead. With a frown, she slid the phone into her pocket and picked up the bottle of champagne. "Come with me. I'm on my way to check in with Zara. I'm sure Greg will be here any minute, but there's no need to panic. Andre will be getting footage of the prep, and it's not a problem to lift stills from the video if we need to." "I like to take a few shots of my own anyway." Raven fell into step beside her. "I'll just need to get Zara's okay if I want to use them." Sophie led him up a wide stone staircase on a terrace that was being set up for the reception to one side of the château's impressive main entrance. Miles of fairy lights were being strung and dozens of chic, pale oak, cross-back chairs positioned around small tables on the flagstones. The space on the other side of the entrance was being swept, and Sophie knew that the small stage under construction at the far end was for the live band that would be rocking the after-party. Florence was on a ladder beside the enormous wooden doors, making final touches to a floral archway that framed the top of the entranceway, a delicate mix of ferns as a backdrop to white roses, peonies and gypsophila. A woman with a long dark braid that reached her waist was reaching up to hand Florence a chain of tiny blue flowers. "There's something blue?" Sophie asked. "Hi, Tilly. I was about to call and find out where you were." Mathilde Pascoe was her personal assistant, expert in everything romantic and passionate about weddings, but more importantly, her closest friend. "These are forget-me-nots," Tilly said in her perfect English, softened by the music of her French accent. She picked up another chain to show Sophie. "There are once woven into every floral arrangement, including a bouquet. Isn't that adorable?" Her smile was so happy it was impossible not to smile back, until Sophie heard the whir of a camera's shutter beside her. "Don't put me in any of your photos, please." Sophie's tone was crisp as she swerved to face Raven. "And make sure you get written permission from anyone else. Tilly, this is Raven. He's doing a feature, possibly for Vogue weddings." "Wow!" Tilly's eyes widened. "It's a lovely photo of you both." Raven turned the camera towards them. "Can I persuade you to let me put in a tiny cameo? People love the behind-the-scenes snippets and the secrets, like hidden flowers with a message." It was a lovely photo. The forget-me-nots were in clear focus. Sophie and Tilly were a little blurred, but not enough to dim the bond evident in the smile they were sharing. They shared another glance with a kind of silent communication they'd been enhancing for years. Tilly gave a tiny shrug. It was for Sophie to choose. "Maybe," Sophie conceded, "but there are more important things to get on with right now, like taking this champagne to Zara's suite before it starts getting warm." It was cooler and darker as they stepped inside the ancient entrance hall to the château. Both Sophie and Raven blinked as their eyes adjusted to the change in light. Raven lifted his camera to take a photograph of a stone fireplace that was filled with dozens of white candles, tall and short, fat and thin, enclosed by a lake of tea lights on the hearth. "They'll look even better when they're lit up for the cocktails in here later," Sophie said. "You've been doing this for a long time," Raven said. "Nearly 10 years. "Yes. That anniversary would be a milestone. The 10-year anniversary that would precede it was not one that Sophie wanted to think about, however. "I've been Googling you," Raven said, as he followed her towards the foot of the grand staircase. "You've got quite a name in the wedding planning business already. That clever little purple van of yours with the sunflowers and lavender decals pops up first time every time you add Provence and weddings into a search bar. Covering an event that'll be seen by the millions of Zara Beaumont's followers is going to make you even more famous." Something in his tone made the hairs on the back of Sophie's neck prickle. Or was it what he'd said? He'd been researching her. Why? Sophie didn't do interviews, didn't engage with social media presence on a personal platform, and the information on her website was strictly business-based. Her preference to stay in the background might be deemed old-fashioned, but her brand was growing organically, with the weddings themselves enough of an advertisement. And Raven's article was supposed to be about this wedding, about someone who was already on the way to being as much of a household name as Martha Stewart, and poised to become even more influential thanks to her marriage to the sole heir of one of America's rich list families. How much sleuthing had this stranger done? Enough to sift through the thousands of people who shared her very common name and uncover something that had only made local news, long enough ago that it should be at least partially shrouded by the mists of time. Something that was probably guaranteed to spike anyone's interest? No, she didn't want to be dragged into the past. She didn't want to think about Tom, or Hannah, or Luc, especially not Luc. No. She could feel rather than hear that repeated word of denial that held an edge of desperation this time. It was tight around her chest, making it impossible to take her next breath. As she always did in moments that threatened to be overwhelming, Sophie touched the small heart-shaped diamond that hung around her neck on a fine gold chain, the only reminder of a lost dream that she could still touch. She had the feeling that he did, indeed, know too much, and Raven's next words confirmed that fear. "Is it true?" he asked quietly, his tone now even more intense. "That you lost your fiancé in a tragic accident on the actual eve of your own wedding?" Chapter 2. Luc Moreau was on the terrace of his Draguignan apartment, but he wasn't looking at his favourite view of the Tour de l'Horloge on its hill as dawn broke in the ancient keep tower, with its distinctive iron cage over the bell, came to life. No, he was pacing back and forth after a restless night, occasionally glaring at his phone that was lying beside his empty coffee cup, as he waited for what might be considered a reasonable time to wake somebody on a Saturday. It wasn't helping that he was an hour ahead of London. But reminding himself of the almost 10-year friendship with the only person left in the world that he genuinely trusted and who knew him better than anyone else alive was helping. Because Luc knew that Paul, who also just happened to be his solicitor, wouldn't hesitate to pick up the call no matter how early it was. Paul had been the only person on his side in the darkest days of his life. He was also the only person who understood why this mattered so much. "Luc," Paul's voice had the rasp of someone not quite awake. "Where are you?" "France." "What's up?" "The bank's on my back. I picked up an email late last night. They've seen the report on the dry rot and the subsequent escalation in the estimates, and they're starting to question my ability to meet the repayments for the mortgage I need for renovations. I can't blame them for being sceptical about the income potential for Moorish photography. Recipe book deals are notoriously competitive, and restaurants and cafes are starting to put their own food photos up on social media these days. So tell them how you really made the money to buy that house." Luc gave a huff of laughter. "What do you think Banksy would say if someone asked him that? Half the attraction is in the mystique, isn't it? The other half, the talent, is more important." Luc's breath came out in a sigh this time. "I'm a lone wolf, as you well know, and I intend to keep my privacy intact. Nobody gets to know why I'm doing this. That's the whole reason we've set up this trust. Nobody ever has to know. As far as the bank is concerned, I'm just someone crazy enough to be spending £3 million on a 19th century house in a London neighbourhood that's close enough to a council estate to make it dodgy. I can't believe you found a standalone Victorian property that's not listed. Rare as hen's teeth in something pre-1850. Yeah, Luc's response was wry. I'm lucky that the budget renovation that turned it into 5 flats damaged so many of the exceptional features. The outside still looked uncannily like the mansion in Dulwich that had become his real home, though. Enough to have brought a painful lump to his throat when he'd stood in front of it for the first time last week. The house where Tom and Hannah had grown up. But it was only a 5-minute walk from Camberwell Towers, the estate he'd grown up on, which made it feel like fate was pushing him into doing something about the dream he'd had for years. Close enough for a youth centre to attract teenagers who might otherwise be getting into a lifestyle they would never be able to escape. Like he'd been lucky enough to do. Thanks to Tom Baxter. Maybe it was a sudden ache in his heart that made his voice raw when he spoke again, or maybe it was the passion he had for this dream. I can't lose this house, Paul. I'll see what I can do. Maybe we can fast forward setting up the charity, getting it registered and finding benefactors, and/or starting a fundraising campaign. We can't do that until we've secured the house. Have you got any shoots coming up? Those shoots? The ones where you get to sell the authenticated prints for silly money. Some extra cash like that landing in your account wouldn't hurt. I cleared my calendar for this week to focus on getting this sorted. Luc frowned as his phone beeped and an option to accept or decline an incoming call appeared on the screen. Gregory Glasson. Why did that name ring a bell? It was on this phone, so it was somebody he'd met in the last 5 years, which meant that it had to have something to do with the rekindled career in photography that had marked the end of years of aimless globetrotting. And it felt like fate might be giving him another nudge. I've got a call coming in, he told Paul. Talk later, yeah? It was the glimpse of Zara's wedding dress that did it. Sophie only saw the Oscar de la Renta dress hanging on the back of the open bedroom door in the bridal suite because she was stepping aside to let both Raven and Andre get the angles they wanted for these candid champagne breakfast shots. She had to stay well out of shot because her working clothes for her busy day consisted of well-worn denim jeans, a t-shirt and sneakers. While her t-shirt and sneakers were both white, her pinafore apron with its lovely pockets, big enough to easily accommodate her phone and her tablet and other essentials, was a deep shade of gold with cream polka dots, which would have totally ruined the pure wedding vibe of this setting. Zara and her bridesmaids were all wearing ivory-coloured floor-length mulberry silk bathrobes with shawl collars and long wide sleeves, tied loosely enough to offer tantalising hints of perfect spray tans and lacy underwear. Choosing eye-catching poses as they were about to put food into their mouths was apparently great fun, and the sound of feminine laughter rippled across the room. Sophie could still feel the genuine enjoyment of this scene that went a long way to making how meticulously choreographed it was acceptable. The aromas of coffee and chocolate and truffles were clear enough to almost taste them. But suddenly, she wasn't seeing the elegant satin strapless gown that frothed into a dramatic train at the back. She was seeing the Disney princess-style dress that she'd chosen for her own wedding, with a gorgeously beaded bodice, the puff sleeves, a sweetheart neckline and hooped petticoats, hanging on the back of her door as she fled into her bedroom as if it might be possible to hide from reality. She could smell the acrid dried blood on the clothes she was wearing and even on her hands, having just come from the hospital where she'd been allowed time to hold the still warm body of the man she'd been going to marry in a couple of hours. And she could feel, overwhelmingly, a shaft of the grief that had come so close to destroying her. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut and turned, so that when she opened them, she would not be looking at a wedding dress. Flashes of this kind of pain were so rare these days, she had forgotten how debilitating they could be, but, thankfully, this one lasted no more than a heartbeat. It morphed with surprising swiftness into a stab of resentment towards the person who was responsible for triggering it. Raven Vale. He had his back to her as Sophie opened her eyes again, his head bent over the small screen of his camera. She had dismissed his intrusive query earlier simply by saying it was not up for discussion. But the reminder had not been so easy to dismiss. There was a heavy weight on her chest that she could feel whenever she took a breath. "Perfect, Zara." Raven's tone suggested that he'd moved on to something far more enjoyable. "No, don't lick off those croissant flakes just yet. Pick up your champagne. Now close your eyes and look as though you're eating the most delicious thing in the universe. Now you can lick your lips. Yeah, that's the shot." "Yeah." A young woman was using her phone to take photos of the same pose. Hashtag Zara's big day. Time to get this party started. "Let me see," Zara demanded. "Nothing gets posted that I haven't okayed." She moved to view what was on her social media content creator's phone, as well as Raven's camera. Sophie could move again, but her resentment wasn't fading as quickly as the flash of grief. It was, in fact, deepening into something closer to anger, but that had always been a familiar aftermath of a flashback, hadn't it? She was confident it would dissipate with her next outward breath, because the anger didn't really have anything to do with this journalist. Maybe it didn't even have much to do with the man who'd actually been responsible for the destruction of life as she'd known it nearly 10 years ago. Perhaps it needed to be directed inwards, for allowing herself to give him any headspace at all. Luc, the man who'd been driving Tom home from the stag do, the man who'd been driving the car too fast that night, the man who'd had too much to drink to be behind the wheel of any vehicle, let alone the brand new luxury sports car that had been Tom's wedding present from his father. Sophie blew out her next breath silently but deliberately. Why was it that the harder you tried to forget someone, the harder it seemed to achieve that goal? The buzzing of the phone in her pocket was a welcome distraction, especially when she saw Greg's name on the screen. "Greg." She turned her back on the breakfast scene, walking towards the mullioned windows with a stunning view of the château's vineyards and a paddock that was populated by a very picturesque herd of donkeys. "Where are you?" "Sophie." To her horror, Greg's voice was rough enough to suggest that speaking was difficult. "I'm so sorry. I'm in hospital in Nice. I've had a heart attack." "What? Oh my God, Greg, a heart attack? Are you okay?" "No." Sophie's head was spinning. "Sorry, what a stupid thing to ask. Of course you're not okay." "I'm still alive." Greg made a sound that could almost be an attempt at laughter. "It seems that's a good start. And I'm about to get fixed with some stents or some such thing. just rang to say I found someone to cover the photography today. Forget the photography, Sophie said, her voice catching. This was Greg all over, wasn't it? Worrying about her when he might be dying. Don't even think about this wedding, she said fiercely. I'll sort it. She became aware of two things then. That the room behind her had become as silent as an echo chamber, and that Greg was speaking again. Already done, Greg croaked. And we got lucky. The Phénix is on his way. The Phénix? Sophie's voice rose. You don't mean Le Phénix, do you? That's him. Greg's voice was fainter. Have to go. Talk you later, love. He ended the call before Sophie could tell him that she'd be in touch with the hospital all day, that she'd be there to see him as soon as possible, that she would do whatever she could to help him recover. Dazed, she clutched her phone as she turned to find everyone in the room staring at her. Raven broke the silence first. Gregory Glasson, your photographer's had a heart attack. Andre had his video camera balanced on his shoulder and his expression said it all. This was a major glitch in what was probably the most important wedding Marry Me in Provence was ever going to cover. But the expression on Zara's face was, oddly, not one of horror. Her eyes were wide and her jaw had dropped. The Phénix? She asked. Are you kidding me? The Phénix? Sophie swallowed. You know him? Zara shook her head. I know of him. Who doesn't? Everybody's heard of him. Raven sounded stunned. He does the most amazing wedding photography in, forever? Zara turned to her bridesmaids. Not real weddings. At least I don't think they are. He probably uses models to do that dystopian thing with stuff like the bride and groom standing in a nuclear wasteland looking like zombies, and they reckon he invented that whole drown the dress trend. He's even set fire to a wedding dress while the bride was still wearing it. Sophie bit her lip. We don't have to use him, she said hurriedly. I've got any number of photographers I can contact. Someone will be available at short notice. But Zara didn't seem to be listening. Oh my God! The bride-to-be had her phone in her hands, her thumbs moving impressively fast. I've got to tell Joe, this is huge. I've never even heard of the Phénix going anywhere near real weddings. Her jaw dropped. Maybe I'm going to be the first real bride he's ever photographed. Sophie could believe that. She wouldn't have had any idea either, but then she wouldn't want him near any of her weddings. She had her doubts that he would be capable of taking any of the kind of wedding photographs that everybody wanted in their albums, like romantic poses around tree branches, staring lovingly into each other's eyes. For heaven's sake, the mysterious Phénix was famous for pushing the boundaries of conventional wedding photography into something so different it could be described as shock art. Sophie had seen the images online. Who hadn't? She dismissed them as more confrontational than edgy or compelling, though, as though the person taking the shots was some kind of cynic who didn't believe in the concept of marriage. Might hate it, even? Not to her taste at all. How on earth did Greg even know the man? This was a looming disaster. Zara was probably just as horrified as she was. I'll get someone else, Sophie promised. She'd find Tilly and get her to help with the phone calls. Alan, their drone operator, was very likely to have a good quality camera or two amongst his gear. Worst case scenario, they could still get all the traditional stills by lifting them from Andre's videos. Raven was staring at her. Why would you pass up an offer to work with someone like Le Phénix? The guy's a living legend. There was no doubt that Zara was looking horrified now. Don't you dare get someone else, she snapped at Sophie. If you do, I'll make sure that you never get another client again, ever. This... She reached for her champagne flute and clearly drained vintage Dom Perignon from her glass without even tasting it. This is mega, she announced. Straight up massive. Guaranteed 100% to go viral. Zara was definitely looking happy, thrilled even. Maybe this unexpected twist could turn out to be a blessing in disguise for everyone, including Sophie. That starstruck look that Raven couldn't hide might mean he'd just lost interest in anything to do with her tragic past history, which was absolutely a bonus, but, while it had been framed jokingly, Zara's threat to eliminate any future bookings had felt a little too real. Any business could be damaged by bad reviews online. Getting dumped on by someone with 8 million followers could probably annihilate hers in one fell swoop. The young women were chattering as Sophie left them to finish their breakfast and move on to the serious business of formal wedding makeup, nails and hair appointments. Teams of salon experts would have completed setting up in the dedicated suite next door by now. No one knows his real name, he just goes by Phénix. Phénix, someone else corrected in an exaggerated accent. They were all scrolling on their phones now. He is French and so sexy, that hosier vibe with the long hair and that black hat and sunglasses. Oh my. He's got nearly as many followers as you, Zara. Wow, look at this. Is that wedding dress really on fire, or is it AI? I don't care, Zara said, as long as I get a photo like that goes viral. Sophie's phone pinged several times in succession as she left the room, and she found the alerts were for the first Instagram posts for #Zara'sBigDay. There was a shot of the grazing table with the pretty sprigs of lavender and tiny bunches of grapes between the platters. There were hands holding up champagne flutes to touch in a circle, the bubbles from the wine creating a faint mist above the rims. The caption ran, "The day has begun." And then there was the shot Sophie had seen Raven taking of Zara with her eyes closed and croissant flakes on her lips. What could be more delicious than the perfect wedding breakfast and champagne? The last image was Zara, with her robe slipping to reveal a bare shoulder, her mouth and nose hidden behind the hand she had cupped beside a bridesmaid's ear. Through a few perfectly tousled curls, she was looking sideways over her fingers, directly into the camera. Shh. It's a secret. Can't tell you yet, but I'm so excited. Sophie almost ran down the sweeping staircase. She needed to find Tilly and tell her not only that Greg was alarmingly physically ill, but that it seemed to have affected his common sense. The success of this day might now depend on whether this surrogate photographer actually turned up, and if he did, it might still be a disaster, because he was highly likely to take photographs that would make conventional wedding photographers throw up their hands in horror, and it would do untold damage to the reputation of Marry Me in Provence. Luc Moreau parked his rented black transit van in the space an usher directed him towards. He was in the right place, he noted. That pale purple vintage van with the lavender hedge across the lower half of its back doors and sunflower blooms scattered along the sides had some romantically curly, cursive sign writing to advertise the name of the business. Marry Me in Provence. For a long, long moment after he'd parked his vehicle, he sat in the driver's seat, his hands still on the steering wheel, simply staring into space. What was he doing? Why hadn't he just told Greg Glasson that he was busy and couldn't possibly do a favour for someone he'd met by chance a few years ago when he dropped into the photography and video show in Birmingham? The two men had bonded over a shared interest in vintage Leica cameras and, in particular, for the 1960s model M3 that Luc had slung over his shoulder in its original leather case. They'd exchanged numbers. For someone who was such a loner, Luc had surprised himself by being the first to reach out, sharing a link to an article celebrating Leica cameras in advance of the approaching 100-year anniversary of the iconic brand. Maybe, even though he hadn't shared any details, it was because Greg seemed to instinctively understand how life-changing it had been for a teenager, living in one of London's more notorious council estates, to save enough to buy a very old camera from the pawn shop and discover a passion for photography. Or perhaps it was because Luc had shared details of his life and the company he worked for, and Luc was the one who understood that protective note in the older man's tone when he talked about his boss. Sophie Spencer. Sophie. Why, judging by the fist-like squeeze in his chest right now, this was the real reason he'd agreed to help Greg out and fill in for him. He should be avoiding that pull towards her like the plague, but he'd done that for nearly 10 years in the hope that it would finally fade, and it hadn't. Not that he'd realised quite how much it was still haunting him until this morning, when Greg had told him that Sophie needed help. At least he was so much stronger now. He'd been through the fires of hell and he'd survived. He'd risen from the flames like the triumphant mythological bird whose name he'd appropriated for his second chance at life. No one could crush him again. Not even Sophie Spencer. Especially not Sophie Spencer. He could do the cliched wedding photos that would be required today, the ones that dripped with a saccharine sweetness that was as fake as the promises the majority of people made on the day turned out to be. He could do a good job. But would Sophie be happy that he was here, or did she hate him with the same amount of passion she had the last time they'd been breathing the same air? Luc was about to find out. He took 2 cameras with him, the latest top-of-the-range Nikon that he would use for the shots today, and the ancient Leica in its leather case, his touchstone, because he never went anywhere without it, and he had the feeling he might need its magic today. The black leather jacket he had on over his black t-shirt and black jeans was going to be far too hot to wear today, but it felt like an extra layer of protection. So did his hat and the sunglasses that would hide any reaction he hadn't anticipated being triggered by proximity to Sophie. At least he had the advantage of being forewarned and therefore forearmed. Sophie would have no idea who Le Phénix truly was. So far, he'd managed to keep the 2 facets of his life completely separate. So why did she seem to recognize him so instantly as he walked towards her a short time later? Why had she gone as still and pale as an Italian marble statue? And why did his name on her lips sound almost like a prayer? Luc? Chapter 3. 12 years ago. Tom wants to meet you. Tom? Sophie was lying on the floor in front of the gas fire, propped up on her elbows. She looked up from the book she was reading. Tom who? Tom Baxter, my brother? Ah, the invisible brother, the one who's been floating around Europe forever. Well, it does feel like forever. Anyway, he's back home now. After a year of working in a restaurant in Paris, washing dishes and working his way up to peeling potatoes, he's decided he wants to become a chef. He's come back to go to cooking school in London for a year or 2, the same college that Jamie Oliver went to, apparently. I thought he was into fast cars. He's been playing with cars since he was a baby, Hannah agreed. The faster the better. I think Daddy's still hoping he'll end up taking over the family business, except he'd probably end up changing its name to Car Doors, which was what he called it when he was about 4 and it became the family joke. Cute. Did he think your dad sold only car doors? No, but the business is called Auto Door, which means golden car in French. Dad wanted something that sounded European and posh so people would know where to go for their Bugattis and Lamborghinis. Tom knew he sold cars, so he put it together and made it Car Doors. And that might have been the first time he made people laugh. And that became his mission in life. He loves making people laugh because that means they're as happy as he always seems to be. And that's why he likes cooking too, to make people happy. Hannah laughed. He couldn't even boil an egg when he left home. He did a degree in media and communication because he had a burning ambition to be a commentator for Formula 1 car races. She was still smiling. No wonder Daddy's grumbling about trust fund money going up in smoke, but he'll be there to support him. He'll probably help set up his first restaurant. Anything to make Tom, the golden child, even happier. My big brother might flit from one passion to another, but at least he's got them. Look at me, doing a degree in liberal arts. It's the degree you do when you just think it would be fun to go to uni for a few years. I have no idea what I want to do. The note of frustration in her best friend's voice was enough to prompt Sophie to close the cover on the book about Stonehenge she'd been absorbed in, doing research for an upcoming essay for her history major. She pushed herself upright into sitting cross-legged. You're only 22. There's plenty of time to decide what you want to do, and a liberal arts degree will give you all sorts of directions you can go in. If all else fails, you can end up being a teacher, like me. How good is it that you included education studies? We might never have met otherwise. The young women shared a fond glance. They'd sat beside each other in that very first lecture, and by the end of the 2 hours, they'd both known they were going to be good friends. Now, about to start their final year, they'd moved out of the halls of residence and were sharing a tiny flat. Adulting, they called it. Serious stuff when you had to do all your own cooking and cleaning and pay the gas bill. Less serious were the activities that Hannah dragged Sophie along to, like salsa classes and yoga and rollerblading in the park. She made life fun, and Sophie loved her for it. She was the one who remembered when the gas bill was due and wrote the deadlines for Hannah's assignments on the wall calendar in their kitchen. They were complete opposites, really, but they fitted together like two sides of the same coin, and by now they knew they would be friends for life. So, there was a note of determination in Hannah's voice. Back to what we were actually talking about. Tom wants to meet you. He said he's heard so much about you for the last couple of years that he feels like he knows you already. I said I'd bring you to the party tomorrow night. What party? It's just family and a few friends. A welcome home party for Tom and Luc, of course. Who's Luc? Tom's bestie. They've been joined at the hip since they were about 15. He's like a member of the family, really. I've always called him my other brother, and my parents love him like another son. Dad says it was only because of Luc that Tom didn't go completely off the rails. Her face sobered. He had a rough patch that's been kind of buried by my family. They like to pretend it never happened, but it did. He got bullied at school, and then in with the wrong crowd and started using some gateway drugs that were heading towards being pretty heavy. I think it might have been worse than I ever got told, but I was scared to ask. Sophie's eyes widened. But he's okay now. Oh yeah, I'm quite sure he hasn't touched any hard stuff for years now. Probably thanks to Luc watching out for him. I was only about 10 or 11, but something happened, and I think Luc got Tom out of really serious trouble. My parents changed his school when they found out what was going on, and he ended up going to the same school as Luc, and the rest, as they say, is history. They've been besties ever since. Did Luc go to uni with Tom? No, I don't think he could afford to. He was brought up by a single mum who apparently had big problems with both alcohol and drugs on one of the worst housing estates in Camberwell. He got a job as a motorbike courier. They flatted together, though, and when Tom decided he wanted a gap year after he graduated, he talked Luc into backpacking around Europe with him for a while. Luc's half French, so I think he was quite keen to go. Tom says he was speaking French like a native by the time they'd been in Paris for a few months. He was only 5 when he came to the UK, but it was all there, tucked away in his brain. How good would it be to be bilingual? Can Tom speak French now, too? Hannah laughed. I doubt it, but it probably didn't matter. He can get away with anything with that smile. Everybody loves Tom. Sophie could see why, when she met him the following evening at the Baxters' gorgeous house in Dulwich, one of London's more prestigious suburbs. He could have been a twin, not just her best friend's brother, with the same wavy brown hair, aristocratic nose, and a smile that was uncannily like Hannah's. So was his laugh and the joie de vivre that gleamed in his hazel eyes. She felt as if she'd known him for years already. Maybe that was why she wasn't afflicted with her usual level of shyness. It was certainly still there when it came to interacting with Luc Moreau, though. He was tall and dark and had an intense gaze that Sophie found more than a little unsettling. That black hair, those almost black eyes. She'd known about men like him since she'd been a child. Her mother had taught her well, and she knew how dangerous they could be. Perhaps it was the blatant admiration.